Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again looking at the pasta developers for January 2021, and this time we're going to have a look at the Naval Forces portion. We're going to do things a little bit differently today because basically there are only two entries that we have, and the two entries are pretty long, and I just want to kind of make a point in this video. I'm going to read them both verbatim, so I'm going to go through and just read all of the text which is available and show you why it is a bad idea just to copy and paste stuff onto these wonderful past to developer posts. It would be really nice if some of the rules were enforced when it comes to these past to developer stuff. One of the rules is that you can't just copy information off third-party stuff. You actually have to modify it. Unfortunately, in this case, this is just not true at all, and you'll see what I mean as I go through these. There is so much useless information here that does not need to be here. It is incredible. So the first one is from Lord Vader, and it is talking about the South Dakota-class battleship, the South Dakota, the BB-57 from 1945. So this thing, its history is about, well, an essay long. So let's get into it. The battleship South Dakota BB-57, the first in the series, entered service on 20th of March 1942. Captain Thomas L. Gatch became its commander, and the battleship was soon destined to become one of the most famous ships of the Second World War. Usually, American sailors give their ships nicknames. South Dakota became known as Sodak, or Battleship X, as it was named in the first official news release. The crew also had a playful nickname for their ship, Big XXXXXXXX, but this was not pronounced contemptuously, but on the contrary, with love. Until August, the battleship passed in the Atlantic a standard but wartime shortened cycle of tests, crew development, and combat training. Then the ship was transferred to the Pacific Ocean. He passed the Panama Canal on the August 21st and headed for the Tonga Islands. Participation in the long and bloody epic off Guadalcanal, which began with the landing of the American Marines on it, became the first page in the history of the new battleship service. Two of a series of almost continuous battles for the island and the surrounding waters were perhaps the most striking combat episodes in the life of the South Dakota, but before that the ship was damaged. On September 6th in the Tonga-Tabu area, he caught the tip of a coral reef not marked on the map. The outer lining of the empty compartments of the double bottom at the stem was ripped open. The ship received extensive flooding. On September 12th, he came to Pearl Harbor to repair the damage. Subsequently, there were reasons to consider this accident a gift of fate, since during the repair, light anti-aircraft artillery was reinforced. The two quadruple Chicago pianos were removed, and 16 Bofors were installed, and at least 20 Ehrlichans were added. This was done very well. Soon, South Dakota was to engage in the first battle with enemy aircraft. A very correct approach to the captain case by Thomas Gatch should be noted. He was a born commander and educator of subordinates. Constant training and disregard for the ostentatious side of the service, which annoyed sailors at all times, he managed to rally his team into a single family eager to fight. The battleship was again ready for a campaign on October 12th and began joint voyages and exercises with the ships of the TF-16, the Task Force 16, led by the famous Big E, the nickname of the aircraft carrier Enterprise. On October 16th, this group left Pearl Harbor and headed for the Espiritu Santo area to join TF-17 of the aircraft carrier Hornet. On October 24th, information was received about a large force of the Japanese fleet aimed at the Guadalcanal area. The Americans prepared to give them a fight. The combined group under the tactical designation TF-16 was commanded by Rear Admiral Kincaid, flag on the Enterprise, and in addition to 2 aircraft carriers, it included the battleship South Dakota, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 air defense cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Kincaid ordered a search for the enemy in the area of the Santa Cruz Islands. At noon of the 25th Patrol, Catalina reported the sighting of Japanese carriers, and TF-16 turned northwest to intercept the enemy. The main battle took place on October 26. At about 7, almost simultaneously, the opponents found each other at a distance of 200 miles. Both groups raised shockwaves of carrier-based aircraft to attack enemy ships, and the Japanese did so about 20 minutes earlier. On the way to the target, the aircraft armada saw each other in the air. The fighters engaged in several battles, but the bulk of the bombers and torpedo bombers rushed to the enemy ships. At 9:10, the Japanese were the first to strike at the Hornet and its group. The aircraft carrier received 2 torpedoes, several bombs, and 2 ram attacks from damaged enemy aircraft. After 10 minutes, the sky cleared, but the fate of the Hornet was sealed. The ship, engulfed in flames, lost its speed. At this point, his own aircraft had not yet reached the Japanese aircraft carriers. The first wave of Japanese aviation could not find the Enterprise in South Dakota. At 900 hours, these ships entered a small rainstorm, which sheltered them from approaching enemy aircraft. All of those fury fell on the Hornet. However, this did not last long. At 9:27, the Japanese concluded from the intercepted radio communications that another American aircraft carrier was nearby. At about 10 a.m., the Enterprise group was attacked by a Japanese submarine, the 121. The destroyer Porter was torpedoed. The second Shaw stayed with him to remove the crew and then finish off the mortally injured comrade. But even without 2 destroyers, the Big E was much more heavily covered by anti-aircraft fire than the Hornet. The South Dakota and other escort ships formed a ring-shaped chain in the center of which was the aircraft carrier. The strongest air defense link was, of course, the new battleship. Soon, South Dakota's radar detected a group of aircraft 55 miles away. TF-16 unit prepared to meet the enemy. The first to arrive were 43 D-3A Val dive bombers. They attacked without waiting for the torpedo bombers that were on the way. The long-awaited time has come for the gunners, perfectly trained by Captain Gatch. The South Dakota's fire was surprisingly effective. The battleship traveled 1,000 yards from the Enterprise and provided it with reliable protection against deadly dive bombers. They came out of the attack very low, at an altitude of no more than 200 meters. At that moment, light and mobile Ehrlichens were well-trained crews literally tore the enemy to pieces with their dagger fire. 26 bombers were shot down. The ship's crew claimed that even 32, but 26 were officially counted. Of the 23 bombs dropped, only 1 hit the battleship. There was also a close gap at the side. Two direct hits and 1 close gap went to the Enterprise. Soon, the Japanese torpedo bombers arrived, 14 dark green Kates. However, only 7 planes managed to drop their torpedoes, which the American ship successfully dodged. While the guns were still rattling, one of the Kates, already damaged, made a suicidal attack. With a suspended torpedo, he crashed into the superstructure of the destroyer Smith. From a powerful explosion, the entire bow of the American ship was engulfed in flames. 28 people were killed, 23 were injured. The accident allowed the South Dakota to extinguish this fire in an original, albeit solely thanks to the courage and resourcefulness of the destroyer crew, and continuing to fire at the planes with her stern guns. Smith quickly passed through the formation of other ships and crashed into the foaming waves of the wake of the battleship, which was in full swing. Streams of water hit the destroyer and helped to cope with the fire. After the Kate's raid, the Japanese gave TF-16 40 minutes of respite. Then the air attacks resumed. In total, 29 aircraft took part in them, mainly dive bombers. And this time, a single 500-pound bomb hit the battleship. The hit fell on the roof of Tower Number 1 on the right side. The armor withstood, and the turret crew, with the exception of 1 officer at the periscope, did not suffer. But 50 other crew members were injured. 1 later died. The shrapnel hit the neck of Captain Gatch, who was standing on the bridge in front of the conning tower. The two 16-inch guns of Tower No. 2 were severely damaged, not used during the entire subsequent Battle of Guadalcanal. One of them later had to be replaced. There was momentary confusion following the bombing of the South Dakota. Management was transferred to post number 2. However, it turned out that the telephone did not work there. For this reason, the uncontrollable South Dakota rushed straight for the Enterprise for a minute. The aircraft carrier had to hastily get out of its way. Big E itself, in the second series of attacks by enemy aircraft, escaped with one close gap at the side. The cruiser San Juan received an armor-piercing bomb. Fortunately, the ship, it pierced through its hull and exploded outside. In the afternoon and evening, Japanese aircraft attacked the Hornet 3 times, first in tow and then left by the crew and motionless. The ship received a torpedo and 2 bomb hits. Already in the dark, the destroyers tried to finish them off, firing countless shells and torpedoes. However, the stubborn aircraft carrier, the hero of the first raid on Tokyo, did not go to the bottom, and he was left by the Americans to fend for themselves. The case was completed by the Japanese destroyers of Rear Admiral Abe at 1:35 on October 27th, hit by 4 610mm torpedoes. The Hornet finally disappeared under the water. The battle at Santa Cruz ended there. The Americans lost their aircraft carriers, destroyer, and 74 aircraft. Aviation of the Imperial Navy lost 100 aircraft and many experienced pilots, which markedly darkened the Japanese with the joy of victory. Here, the South Dakota gunners played their parts. 26 aircraft shot down by the ship's anti-aircraft fire in one battle is an absolute record, and it seems for all time. That same night, while retreating to Noumea, the South Dakota and the destroyer Mahan maneuvered unsuccessfully in an attempt to invade an attack by a Japanese submarine. There was a collision that caused quite serious damage. At first, it seemed that the battleship would have to be sent for repairs from the United States. The database conducted a detailed examination. It turned out that the damage was not so great. Only 5 fuel tanks were damaged. The repair was carried out by the forces of the floating workshop. A few days later, the South Dakota returned to service in order to soon re-engage in the fight for Guadalcanal. In November 1942, the battle for the island boiled with renewed fury. After some lull, both sides decided to attack the enemy with large forces and turn the course of events in their favor on Guadalcanal and in the surrounding waters. South Dakota faced severe tests. By November 10th, the Japanese had concentrated in nearby bases a large number of aircraft and warships of the 2nd and 8th Fleets of Vice Admirals Nobutake Kondo and Genichi Mikawa. As always, the Tokyo Express was ready for dispatch as part of the famous 2nd Destroyer Squadron of Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka and the transport convoy she guarded. 3 days later, events entered their climax. The battle went on day and night. Both sides suffered heavy losses. The Japanese lost the battleship Hai and 2 destroyers. The Americans lost the light cruisers Atlanta, Juno, and 4 destroyers. Many hundreds of sailors gave their lives on this bloody Friday the 13th. Among them were 2 American admirals, Scott and Callahan. The latter was a personal friend of President Roosevelt. The next day was no less intense. On the night of November the 14th, Admiral Mikawa's 8th Fleet cruisers managed to fire at Henderson Field, named after the Marine Corps SB-2U Vindicator dive bomb commander, Major L.R. Henderson, who died in the Battle of Midway. He was one of the main targets of the Japanese and the key to the American defense of Guadalcanal. However, the results were not as large-scale as during the raid of October 14th-15th. This time, 18 aircraft were destroyed and 32 damaged, but the airfield continued to operate. During the day, his planes, as well as aviation from Espiritu Santo and from the aircraft carrier Enterprise, inflicted the greatest loss on the Japanese. They destroyed the heavy cruiser Kinugasa of the 8th Fleet of Mikawa and 7 of 11 transports with troops from the Tanaka convoy. Several more warships and transport ships were damaged. Admiral Makawa, the hero of the famous night battle of the Savo Island, withdrew. In fact, he left Tanaka's convoy without cover for large ships. The battle did not stop there. The actions of the American aircraft seriously disrupted the plans of the Japanese commander, Admiral Kondo, flag on the heavy cruiser Atago. However, he did not want to give up his goal. Admiral Tanaka, who was abundantly endowed with the notorious Japanese tenacity, was also an unshakable supporter of continuing the operation. Under cover of darkness, Kondo intended to bombard Henderson Field again and land reinforcements for his forces on Guadalcanal. The denouement came in the night battle from November 14 to 15. The battleship South Dakota took part in it as part of Task Force 64 under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, who was flying the flag on the Washington. Except for 2 linear ships, the Americans had 4 destroyers. On the evening of the 13th, this group separated from Admiral Kincaid's forces, who were cruising with the Enterprise south of Guadalcanal. She was tasked with preventing the shelling of the airfield on the island. Lee did not have time to do this on the night of November 14th, and the Japanese were able to more or less successfully bombard Henderson Field, but in the evening his ships approached the island. Soon they were met with the main forces of Kondo, battleship Kirishima, heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, light Sendai and Nagara, 9 destroyers. Skirting the western tip of Guadalcanal in the evening twilight, Lee led his units towards the enemy. Based on the latest information received at about 1600, the Americans expected to intercept the enemy soon. Although the battleship admiral's wrinkled, weather-beaten face remained unchanged, Lee was uneasy. The 64th Task Force had just been formed. It had no experience of joint actions. The ships did not have time to float. Even a night signal has not been deployed. In addition, there was no well-functioning encryption communication with the landing forces on Guadalcanal. Willis Augustus Lee was a very capable, resourceful, and confident commander, well-versed in the latest technology. Before the war, he was involved in the introduction of radar in the fleet and knew more about radars than the operators sitting at their consoles. During the day, the admiral would not worry about anything. His 1.5 dozen 16 inches were able to quickly deal with the enemy. But now he was threatened with the confusion of a fight in complete darkness. Unidentified markers appeared and disappeared on the radar screens every now and then. The system of recognition, friend or foe, in 1942 was in its infancy and in practice has not yet worked. Radar operators in such conditions could simply get confused, and the sophisticated in night battles, the Japanese were able to easily sneak up and plant their powerful torpedoes on board the new American battleships. In addition, in the dark, you can get hit by their Mosquito forces patrolling the straits between the islands of Guadalcanal, Savo, and Florida. Their base was nearby on Tulagi. By the way, this almost happened. 3 torpedo boats were talking on the radio for a long time, deciding whether to send the fish into the hulks that had emerged from the darkness of the night. Lee had no specific operational plan. There was simply no time to develop it. He only ordered other ships to follow their signals. Having rounded the island of Savo, the 64th unit turned right at 2110 and entered the dangerous waters of the Iron Bottom Strait, so named because of the large number of ships sunk there. Destroyers were moving ahead, followed by Washington and South Dakota. There has been no contact with the enemy yet. Only far to the west could be seen the reflection of the burning Japanese transports from the landing party destroyed the day before. The young moon illuminated a completely clean strait. A light breeze blew from the left shell and slightly rippled on the surface of the sea. When at 2148 Savo was exactly on the right traverse, Lee turned on a course of 150 degrees. The radar screens reflected only the shores of the island. The arrows of the magnetic compasses gave anomalous readings. The connection went exactly over the graveyard of ships sunk here in large numbers during previous battles. It was at this moment that negotiations of American torpedo boats were spotted. What? Lee reacted quickly. He personally knew Major General of the Marine Corps, Alexander E. van der Lift, with whom they attended the academy. He was now on Guadalcanal. The admiral hoped van der Lift hadn't forgotten his old nickname, Ching Li, the Chinese, and sent an open request over the radio, with the demand to stop the boatmen and give information about the enemy. Fortunately, he was understood, but there was no fresh information about the enemy ships. It was only clear that they were somewhere nearby. Lee correctly assumed that the Japanese were descending to Guadalcanal through the Slot Strait. Meanwhile, Kondo's squadron was approaching in several groups. 2 detachments made up the near and far curtain of the light forces. A bombardment groups, the battleship Kirishima, and 2 heavy cruisers moved behind them. Kondo planned to begin shelling the airfield at the same time as the landing from the 4 surviving Tanaka transports approaching Saivo with a destroyer escort. The first to notice the enemy was the Japanese light cruiser Sendai, the flagship of the commander of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron, Counter-Admiral Shinataro Hashimoto. At 10:10 p.m., he reported to Kondo that 6 enemy ships had been found. At the same time, the battleships were mistaken for heavy cruisers. The commander gave the order to regroup to strike at the enemy, who did not yet suspect about the proximity of the Japanese. The calculation was, as always, on superiority and night torpedo attacks. Then it was necessary to finish off the enemy with artillery. The Japanese had been following the American ships for over 30 minutes. At 22:52, the moon was closed by the mountains. Lee found it too dangerous to go to the previous course in total darkness. He ordered to turn right towards Cape Esperance. As soon as the ships made this maneuver, a mark appeared on the radar screens of first Washington and then South Dakota. It was the light cruiser Sendai, which was 9 miles northeast. At 23:12, the target was captured by the director's periscopes of the main caliber of Washington. Around the same time, enemy ships were visually detected from the South Dakota Bridge at a distance of 16.5 kilometers. The leading destroyers had not seen anything yet. At 23:15, the Japanese fired torpedoes at TF-64, and a minute later, Admiral Lee ordered the battleships to open fire. After the first volleys, the Sendai was the destroyer Sikin rushed north, setting up a smokescreen to the limit of the range of the artillery radar. They were pursued by heavy shells from battleships. At 23:22, the American destroyers joined the battleship's fire. However, they almost missed the danger from other directions. Japanese ships lurking in the shadows on the southern coast of the Savo were only seen at the last moment. The oversight cost many lives. 6 destroyers and the light cruiser Nagara enveloped the head of the American column and opened heavy fire. Then they fired torpedoes. The American crew's hopes for radars did not materialize. Marks from the surrounding mountains interfered. I had to fire, guided by gun flashes. In such conditions, the battleship's gunners were even more difficult. The fire from their guns did little to help the destroyers. The Japanese counter-shooting was very accurate, affected by training and hard training at night, and besides in the harsh sea of Okhotsk. Found their victims and 2 Japanese torpedoes. As a result, after 20 minutes of combat, all American destroyers were withdrawn from the game, not having time to release a single of their fish. 2 of them, which received torpedo hits, soon sank. The third was crippled by enemy artillery and was completely incapable of combat. In the morning, he had to be finished off. Only the heavily damaged destroyer Guin could still somehow fight. After the battle, she independently returned to the base of the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. For the Japanese, only the destroyer Ayanami was in a hopeless state, later sunk. On the whole, the first phase of the battle was going badly for the Americans. They walked as a single group, and Kondo divided his forces into several parts, which in the darkness attacked the enemy from different directions. The pugnacious Sendai, with the destroyer Sikin, also returned to the scene of the battle. They were now looming over Lee's compound from the stern. In addition, the destroyer of Tanaka who was a real master of night combat, could also join the case. 2 weeks later, at Tassafarong, he brilliantly proved this by defeating Rear Admiral Wright's 67th unit of 5 cruisers and 4 EMs with just 8 destroyers. In such a situation, American radar operators found themselves in a quandary. They looked in confusion at the screens with numerous marks, wondering what was behind them, and the commanders were completely bewildered by the conflicting reports of the movement of the enemy ships. At the start of the battle, South Dakota followed Washington. However, at 23:33, after 17 minutes of firing, an unpleasant accident occurred on the ship. The shocks from their own fire led to short circuits in the power cables of the 4th Director of Medium Artillery. Automation blocked the supply of electricity, and a general overload in the network led to the loss of half of the battleship's electrical power. The fuses were blown and the power supply to the front of the ship was cut off. The backup network suffered the same fate, as the cause for the short circuit persisted. Following this, the main voltage completely disappeared. The power drives of all the towers stopped, the gyroscopes stopped rotating, but the loss of radars had a particularly frightening effect on the crew. This plunged people into a state close to panic. However, after a few minutes, the problems were localized and the ship's power supply resumed. Remaining de-energized, only 2 directors of Universal Artillery. By the way, a week earlier, the same type of Massachusetts got into a similar situation off the coast of North Africa. The reason was the same, the concussion from their own shooting. Subsequently, on all new battleships to avoid such accidents, the electrical panels and power wiring were redone. All this time, South Dakota tried to follow in the wake of the flagship. However, she had to duck to the left in order not to ram the sinking destroyer Benham. At this moment, the silhouette of the battleship was clearly outlined in the light of the fire on 2 other American destroyers. In addition, the gunners brought in the newly earned artillery, firing a volley from the stern guns of the main caliber at the cruiser Sendai. As a result, the battleship received additional illumination in the form of its own seaplanes set on fire by muzzle gases, previously left on catapults. The next volley swept both vehicles overboard, leaving several small fires in the stern. At this point, South Dakota had already lost contact with Washington. Without the SG radar, it could not be restored. But the enemy saw everything perfectly. 8 minutes after the battleship's artillery resumed action, at 23:43, Japanese searchlights illuminated it for 30 seconds. A flurry of fire from the Kirishima, Takao, and Otago hit the South Dakota from a very close range, approximately 5,300 meters. Then other Japanese ships joined in. In a short time, from 23:24 to 00:05, the American battleships received 27 hits, with shells ranging from 5 to 14 inches. Fortunately for the ship, a swarm of torpedoes fired at it passed by. It was incredible luck. While the Japanese were shooting South Dakota, her comrade Washington was left out of the attention of the enemy. It was his turn to say the decisive turn in the battle. The boldest mark was chosen on the artillery radar screen. Lee hesitated for a while, trying to make sure it wasn't South Dakota. Just then, she was lit by a Japanese searchlight. Doubts were dispelled, and the admiral ordered to open fire. From a distance of 7.5 to 8 kilometers, Washington, without interference, began to thrust shells into the target one after the other. She was, of course, the Kirishima, the only battleship of the Kondo formation. For 7 to 8 minutes, the Japanese ship received 9 406mm armor-piercing suitcases out of 75 fired at it, at least 40 127mm shells, and was completely disabled. Lee watched with satisfaction as the Kirishima burned and exploded. The enemy battleship was fatally damaged. After the battle, the crew left it, and at 3:20, the old ship disappeared into the water. And South Dakota at 008 managed to get out of enemy fire. There was no way to continue the night battle. The battleship had serious problems. Only one radar could operate. The directors and internal communication systems were disabled. The third main battery tower did not rotate. It could be even worse, if not for the large deceleration of the fuses of Japanese shells. 0.4 to 0.08 versus the 0.035 to 0.02 of the Americans. They counted on drawing underwater holes in the waterline area. In addition to the long delay of the fuse, the projectiles had a special shape on the head tips, which created better conditions for movement of the underwater part of the trajectory. However, as a result, many of them pierced the superstructures through and flew into the sea without breaking or exploded from the opposite side at the particular large distance from the enemy ship. From some time, Washington successfully pretended to be an entire unit, constantly trying to communicate by radio with the South Dakota and distract the enemy's attention from it. At 0:20, he turned onto a 340-degree course, leading to Tanaka's transports. Japanese cruisers and destroyers rushed to intercept. The American battleship skillfully evaded the released last torpedoes. Finally, Kondo lost the desire to continue pursuit, and at 0:25 he ordered to begin the retreat. Admiral Lee, making sure that nothing threatened the South Dakota, also ordered the commander of the Washington to withdraw. It was too risky to remain in a dangerous area and develop success, and aviation could finish off the damaged enemy ships in the morning. The Americans were already very lucky. Not one of the many long spears fired by the enemy hit their battleships. Washington went full speed and melted into the darkness of the night. With Chinese observation, Lee plotted a course as far as west as possible, close to the Japanese-occupied shores. The admiral was afraid of torpedo attacks and wanted to entice possible pursuers with him in order to further secure the damaged South Dakota. By the way, there is like 6 or 7 paragraphs more, just to let you know. Without SG radar, the radio communication, the battleships was unable to re-establish contact with the flagship. I had to go alone to the pre-appointed rendezvous point. The American battleships met safely at 9 a.m. Despite 27 shells, there was no serious damage or danger to the South Dakota. The armor reliably protected all the vital centers of the ship: gun turrets, cellars, vehicles, main control posts. By the way, after this battle, no one else disputed the usefulness of the heavily armored cabin of battleships. Some compartments were flooded, but the barely noticeable list to starboard was easily corrected by counter-flooding. Many small fires were soon put out. Losses in the crew were 38 killed and 60 wounded. The superstructures were extensively damaged, but the main thing is the almost complete loss of the radar, without which the crew felt depressed as if blindfolded. The main battle, the battle that ended was the only battle between the new American battleships and an enemy of their own ship class, except for the Battle of Massachusetts with the unfinished Jean Bart in the base, which will be discussed later. It was also a turning point in the Epic of Guadalcanal, although the Japanese fought unsuccessfully for the island for more than 2 months. South Dakota did not become, as it might seem, just a passive victim of the night battle. The battleship riveted the enemy's attention to itself, therefore ensuring the successful actions of Washington and the overall victory of the 64th Task Force. Upon the South Dakota's arrival in Noumea, the repair ship Prometheus hastily patched the holes and repaired some of the battleship's other damage. On the November 25th, he came to Tonga Taba and then went home. The ship docked at the New York Naval Port on December 18th. Elimination of damages required 62 days of round-the-clock work. At the same time, anti-aircraft artillery was reinforced. We removed all 28mm assault fuses. Instead, the ship received numerous Ehrlichs and Bofors. They also made minor alterations in the superstructure, but in order to expand the firing sectors of anti-aircraft guns. In general, the South Dakota from this time has always carried several more barrels of light artillery than its sister ships. This partially compensated for the shorter 4 Universal 5 inches. Repairs and rebuilding were completed by February 25, 1943, and the battleship entered service. Until mid-April, he went through a cycle of tests and training voyages in a group with the aircraft carrier Ranger. The ship was then sent to England and until August 1943 operated in conjunction with the British Home Fleet based at Scapa Flow. Here South Dakota, together with the same type Alabama, mainly provided cover for the northern convoys. Then the battleship returned to the Pacific Ocean. Now his main occupation was the bombardment of Japanese coastal fortifications and air defense of aircraft carrier formations. In November 1943, South Dakota took part in Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. She later supported landings on the Marshall Islands, Makin Atoll, and Tarawa with fire. On December the 6th, South Dakota, together with 5 other battleships, bombarded the island of Nauru. At the end of January 1944, the ship, together with the North Carolina and Alabama, fired at Roy, Namur, and Kwajalein in February to March. It covered carrier positions. It covered carrier formations during the attack of the Caroline Islands, shooting down 4 aircraft. Then there was the Japanese stronghold on the island of Saipan in the Mariana Archipelago, Truk Tinian Ponape Utility Yap in the Carolines, Palau, Hollandia in New Guinea, and so on. U.S. battleships did not remain without combat work, unlike many of their European and Japanese counterparts. On the evening of May 15, 1944, during Operation Forager, capture of Saipan and Tinian, a group of Japanese fighters and bombers broke through an air barrier to TF-58, which included South Dakota. When repelling the raid, the anti-aircraft gunners of the battleship shot down 4 aircraft and damaged 1. From June 19th to June 20th, the battleship took part in the famous battle of the First Mobile Fleet of Admiral Ozawa in the Philippine Sea. More about this battle will be told when describing the history of the service Alabama. During the morning battle on June 19th at 10:49, the Japanese dive bomber Judy hit the South Dakota with a 500-pound bomb. The hit fell on the first deck of the superstructure. The admirals and command premises, electrical cables, and pipelines were damaged. The ship turned out to be 24 killed and 27 wounded, but this did not violate its combat effectiveness. 2 minutes later, the battleship's Universal Artillery shot down Japanese aircraft using shells from a radio fuse. In August 1944, the South Dakota underwent maintenance and modernization at Puget Sound. Quadruple Bofors were added in large numbers. Subsequently, the ship continued fighting until the end of the war. He participated in operations to capture the Philippine Islands, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, as well as in the bombing of the islands of the Japanese metropolis. On May 6, 1945, an emergency occurred in the battle near Okinawa. The South Dakota was receiving ammunition from the Wrangler supply vessel when a powder charge ignited during the loading of the main caliber cellars, or main battery cellars. From one cap flared up, 4 more ignited and exploded. The urgent flooding of the cellars of Tower No. 2 saved the ship. During the incident, 3 people died. 32 were injured, burned, and poisoned. 8 of them subsequently died. It was not possible to find out the cause of the fire in the end. Perhaps it was a spark due to static electricity accumulated in the powder. The ship was taken for repairs to the island of Guam and then Leyte. From there, on July 1st, 1945, the South Dakota headed for the Japanese islands. She continued to provide cover for aircraft carrier formations and carried out shelling of coastal fortifications. On July 14th, the battleship, as part of an artillery group, bombarded the coast of Honshu. The blow was struck at the Kamachi metallurgical plants. This was the first time the heavy U.S. ships were fired upon a Japanese homeland. Then Hokkaido, Hamatsu, and again Honshu were bombed with the participation of the South Dakota. The shelling continued until the surrender of Japan and even a little later. Finally, on August 27th, the battleship anchored at Sagami 1, Honshu Island, and 2 days later crossed into Tokyo Bay. From there, on September 20th, the South Dakota sailed through Okinawa and Pearl Harbor to the U.S. West Coast. On January 3rd, 1946, the ship arrived at the Philadelphia shipyard. During the war years, the battleship South Dakota covered 247,000 miles. His versatile guns and anti-aircraft guns shot down 64 enemy aircraft. The ship was awarded 13 battle stars. On January 31st, 1947, the South Dakota's flag was lowered and she was put into reserve. Since that time, the battleship has been stored at the Philadelphia Naval Dockyard. In 1954, a preliminary project was considered to modernize battleships of the South Dakota and North Carolina, or North Carolina types, in terms of increasing their speed to 31 knots. For this, it was planned to remove the main caliber aft tower and place a new power plant in the hull. For South Dakota, its capacity was supposed to be equal to 256,000 horsepower. In addition, it was supposed to modernize the electronics and strengthen the protection. The project cost was an estimated $40 million. However, this restructuring was soon cancelled, since the role of the battleship in the future and the need of the fleet for them looked unclear. On June 1, 1962, the battleship South Dakota was officially removed from the list of the U.S. Navy, and in October its hull was sold for scrap for $466,425. Separate parts, the main, mast, and fragments of 16-inch guns were bought by the state, whose name the ships bore. They were subsequently installed on the Sioux Falls Memorial on a simulated deck surrounded by a bush hedge. This machine had 3 triple-mounted 406mm, 8 dual-mounted 127mm, 17 quad-mounted 40mm, and 64 single 20mm guns. It also had a top speed of 27.8 knots with 3 seaplanes on it. Can you now understand why it's a bad idea just to copy and paste random stuff and then translate it into another language? Yes, this started off in Russian and ended up in English. Anyway, let's get on to the next one. So the next one, unfortunately the last one, is once again from Lord Vader, and it's about the Kongo-class battleship, the Haruna, from 1945. This machine, it's kind of interesting because after starting calling it battleship, it's then called a battlecruiser, so is how it is. Anyway, we're going to do this verbatim again just to show how ridiculous this is and how hopefully something is eventually done about it, and hopefully people just stop copy and pasting tons of random information that has nothing to do with anything. The battlecruiser Haruna was laid down on March 16, 1912 at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe, launched on December 14, 1913, and commissioned on April 19, 1915. After passing the tests, he was enlisted in the 1st Battle Division. In 1916-17, he was in the 3rd Division. During the First World War, he patrolled the Pacific Ocean looking for German raiders. In 1917, a battlecruiser was blown up by a mine placed by the German auxiliary cruiser Wolf, Captain 2nd rank Nerga, in the Southwest Pacific. Haruna safely reached the nearest port, then crossed over to Japan. After the completion of the restoration work, he returned to the fleet. After the First World War, the ship began a period of routine service. Its crew underwent combat training. In September 1920, during a regular shooting practice, a detonator prematurely detonated in one of the guns of Tower No. 1. The gun exploded. The explosion opened the roof of the towers. 7 people were killed, including the tower commander. 8 were seriously wounded. After refurbishment, Haruna returned to service. In the future, the interwar service passed without incident. Like other ships of the type, the battleship has undergone several upgrades. 1941 saw Haruna in the 3rd Battleship Division of Vice Admiral Mikawa. In November 1941, the ship entered the 2nd Fleet of Vice Admiral Kondo. November 29 to December 1st, the transition from the metropolis to Mako, Pescador Islands took place. On December the 2nd, the ship received a radiogram about the beginning of hostilities. December 8th, Haruna, as part of the formation, leaves Mako and goes to the South China Sea to cover amphibious operations. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the threats from the American fleet disappeared, but the British Z-Force remained. On December 9th-10th, the battleship, together with the Kongo and other ships of the Japanese fleet, pursued enemy formations, but the Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by aircraft. On December 11th, the ships of the Imperial Navy arrived in Ramkhan Bay, Indochina. From the 14th to the 17th, Haruna was at sea, providing long-range cover for the 2nd Malay convoy. After completing the task, the compound returned to Cam Ranh. staying in this base from December 17th to 20th. Then the ship, as part of the formation, covered the landing in Langayn Bay in the Philippines, patrolled off the coast of Luzon from December 21st to 24th, and returned to Cam Ranh again to meet the new 1942. On January the 8th, 1942, an interbase transition from Cam Ranh to Mako took place, where they arrived in January the 11th. On 3 days later, the ships left for the island of Palau, Caroline Islands. From January 21st to 25th, Haruna covered the air raid on Ambon. Then, after completing several combat missions, arrived in Palau on February the 16th to cover the raid of an aircraft carrier formation on Port Darwin in Australia. In late February and early March, Haruna covered the landing operations of Indonesia. On March the 7th, together with the Kongo and 2 destroyers, fired at Christmas Island, and on March 14th arrived in Starig Bay, Celebes Island. The operation in the Dutch colonies was successfully completed. After 3 months of continuous voyage, the crews received a short rest. From March 26th to April 11th, Haruna took part in the famous Indian Ocean raid. After a stand-up in Singapore, the compound left for Japan, arriving on April 23rd for the Hirazama raid. In late April, early May, the ship underwent maintenance, modernization, and docking. On May the 1st, the battleship commander, Captain First Rank Takama, was promoted to Rear Admiral. After the completion of the work, Haruna took part in the maneuvers of the United Fleet, returning on the 23rd of May to the Hashiburama raid. During Operation MI, the invasion of Midway, the battleship became part of the aircraft destroyers. The battleship became part of the aircraft carrier strike force of Vice Admiral T. Nagumo. It also included the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kara, Hiryu, and Soryu, the battleship Kirishima, the cruisers Tone, Tikuma, the light cruisers Nagara, and Levant destroyers. On the May 27th, this unit went to sea. The crossing took place in harsh storm conditions and poor visibility. On June 4th, 1942, Haruna took part in the battle. At 4:30 in the morning, a reconnaissance aircraft launched from the catapult to the battleship, which was given the extremely important task of finding an enemy aircraft carrier formation. At 0800 hours, the Haruna and Kirishima were attacked by 10 outdated Vindicator dive bombers. The young Marines managed to achieve only 2 close explosions at the side of the Haruna. He received a minor damage to the hull in the aft part. The rangefinder and the main caliber was jammed by a concussion. After the attack of the American carrier-based dive bombers, Haruna assisted the burning aircraft carrier Kaga. At 16 hours 9 minutes, the ship was attacked by B-17 heavy bombers and received no losses or damage. At 17 hours 7 minutes, the battleship was selected to attack 2 Dontals dive bombers from the aircraft carrier Yorktown CV-5. There were no hits or injuries. At 18:26 hours, when the Haruna was providing assistance to the damaged aircraft carrier Hiryu, it was attacked by B-17 bombers. On June the 5th, the remnants of the Air Force joined the main force. The Haruna led all 11 destroyers. In the afternoon, the surviving sailors from the sunken aircraft carriers were transferred from them. On June 14th, the ships arrived in Japan. On June 20th, Captain First Rank Ishii took command of the battleship. Rear Admiral Tacoma went up for promotion. He received a destroyer division. July 14, 1942, Harupa was transferred to the 2nd Fleet, along with the same type Kongo, so the 3rd Battleship Division of Rear Admiral T. Kurita was formed. In early August, the battleship arrived in Kuri, where combat damage was repaired, modernization work and docking was carried out. The work was completed on September the 5th, and on September the 6th, both battleships of the 3rd Division and 2 destroyers leave Kure. On September the 10th, they arrived at Truk, and on the same day set out at sea. Ships of the 2nd and 3rd Fleets patrolled the Solomon Islands. There was no meeting of the enemy, and on September 23rd, they returned to Truk. In the first week of October, the workers of the local shipyard installed a Type 22 radar station on the ship. On October 11th to 14th, Haruna took part in the operation against Gunderson Airfield on Guadalcanal. The ammunition consumption was 438 rounds of the main caliber and 21 anti-mine caliber. They Then they patrolled the waters of the Solomon Islands. On October 26th, the ship took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. Haruna repelled air attacks, received no damage, and returned to Truk on October the 30th. In November, Haruna and Kongo patrolled, providing cover for the next operation to shell the Gunderson airfield. In the two-day battle that broke out, Hale and Kirishima were killed. On November 17th, Haruna returned to Truk. Until the end of 1942, the battleship did not go out to sea. Before the new year, the Imperial headquarters decided to evacuate troops from the island of Guadalcanal, and in January the battleship was part of the formation covered the evacuation. With such intense use of the ships Haruna and Kongo, repairs were required. On the 15th of February, both battleships, the seaplane transport Nisia and the destroyer Siguri, left Truca Lagoon, and on the 20th of February they arrived in Kure. Haruna stands against the wall of the local plant, and it carried out current repairs of the hull and mechanisms and a large modernization works, dismantled 652mm guns, strengthened armor in the areas of the steering compartment, strengthened air defense with 25mm anti-aircraft guns, installed a radar station, Type 21, detection of air and sea targets. The work was completed on March 31st, and on April 1st, Haruna and Kongo leave for Truk. Where they arrived on April 6th. Throughout April, the battleship stood on the lagoon. On May 1st, the ship's commanding officer was promoted to Rear Admiral. In the second half of May, the position of the Japanese in the Aleutian Islands deteriorated sharply. Therefore, some of the ships from Truk were transferred to the metropolis. A powerful formation was formed there. After the fall of the garrison on Attu Island, the counter-strike was cancelled. In May, Haruna was undergoing minor maintenance in the... You know what? I can't be bothered with this. Actually, no, there isn't that much left. There's not that much left. You know what? We'll keep going, just to prove a point. Right. In May, Haruna is undergoing minor maintenance. In the first half of the Nyun, naval exercises were held, and after their completion, another change of commanders took place. Counter-Admiral Ishii was appointed Chief of Staff of the Sasebo Naval Base. On June 16th, the formation of the Imperial Navy leaves Yokosuka. Battleships Haruna, Kongo, aircraft carriers Ryuds, Onye, Chiyo, heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya, and despite attacks by the American submarines, ships on June 21st safely arrived at Truk. The Haruna remained in the lagoon until mid-September. On September 18th to 25th, an exit took place as part of the formation to intercept American aircraft carriers that attacked the islands of Tarawa, Maki, and Abemama. The next trip to the sea took place from the 17th to the 26th of October, this time to intercept American aircraft carriers attacking Wake Atoll. In November and part of December, the battleship stood in Trunka Lagoon. On December the 11th, the battleships Kongo and Haruna go to sea, guarded by two destroyers. On December the 16th, the ships arrived in Sasebo. There, the ships underwent repairs and docking, and then a course of combat training in the inland sea of Japan. On January the 5th, 1944, another change of commanders took place. Captain First Rank Morishita was appointed commander of the battleship Yamato. His place was taken by Captain First Rank Shigenaga. On March 8th to the 14th, the battleship moved to Lipta Roads and was assigned to the second strike formation of the leading mobile fleet. The spring of 1944 pressed calmly for Harun. Only interbase crossings and rare trips to the sea for exercises took place. In June 44, the Imperial Navy launched Operation A, leading to the first battle in the Philippine Sea. On June the 20th, the battleships Kongo, Haruna, and the aircraft carrier Toyoda were attacked by deck-based dive bombs, Helldiver, and torpedo bombers Avenger. Four Helldivers from the aircraft carrier Cabot, CV-28, attacked the Haruna. Several bombs went off near Tower 4 and on the deck of the poop. Some of the bombs exploded near the side. From the concussion, the seams in the side plating parted. Water began to flow into the ship's hull, flooding the charging cellar. The speed dropped to 27 knots. The loss of the crew was 15 killed, but there were many wounded. During this battle, the Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers. After the battle, Haruna entered Okinawa, transferred part of the fuel to the destroyers, and then left for the metropolis. In the period from the June 24th to August 16th, the battleship was in Sasebo. The forces of the local shipyard repaired combat damage, carried out docking, installed 25mm assault rifles, and a Type 13 radar. After the completion of the work, boxes and containers were loaded on board, in which there was a Type 13 radar station for one of the ships of the Second Fleet. On August 15th, Haruna left Sasebo escorted by 3 destroyers. On August 18th, at 0024 hours, the compound was discovered by the American submarine Sailfish, SS-192. Using a radar station, the submarine took up a conventional position for an attack and at 14:35 fired a 4-torpedo salvo at the Haruna. But the torpedoes did not hit the targets, and on August 21st, the battleship arrived in Singapore with the most valuable cargo. The next day, Haruna left for Lipta Roads to meet with Kongo, having stood there for 2 months. On October 15th, the battleship commander was promoted to Rear Admiral. On October 18th to 20th, the passage to Brunei Bay, Borneo Island, took place. When the Americans landed in the Philippines, the entire Imperial Navy was involved in an anti-amphibious operation. Haruna became part of the most powerful central unit of Vice Admiral T. Kurita. Between 22nd and 27th of October, the Japanese fleet was defeated, but Haruna was lucky again. It got off with only minor injuries. On October 24th, 2 bombs hit the battleship. On 28th of October, he returned to Brunei. On November the 6th, the light cruiser Kiso arrived in the bay, accompanied by 2 destroyers, and delivered ammunition for the Harun. On the November 8th to 11th, Haruna went to sea together with all the surviving ships to cover the breakthrough of a small formation to Manila. On November the 15th, the battleship Nagato was added to the 3rd Division. On November 16th, ships in Brunei Bay were attacked by American aircraft. After the raid, some of the ships left for the metropolis, but the Haruna and the cruisers Ashigara, Hagura, Oyoda remained in the roadstead. On November 17th to 18th, they were left with Spratly Island. Left for Spratly Island. The aircraft carrier battleships Ice and Hyuga and the experimental destroyer Samatsuki were already there. These ships were also used to unload cargo, and troops were drawn from Manila. Soon destroyers arrived in this bay, and on one of them was the commander of the 5th Fleet, Vice Admiral Sima. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Ashigara. And that's where it ends. This thing had 4 dual-mounted 356mm, 8 single-mounted 152s, 6 dual-mounted 127s, 30 triple-mounted 25s, 2 dual-mounted 25s, and 23 single 25s on it too. Has a lot of guns. It's a battleship at the end of the day. Right, if you've made it this far, first of all, I congratulate you. Well done. Have a pat on the head. Understand that this is kind of ridiculous when it comes to the naval stuff, how people are just taking sources from other places and just copy and pasting the whole damn thing, and it's somehow getting past the developers even though it is against the rules. If this doesn't change in the future, then I'm just not going to cover the naval stuff anymore. It is incredibly painstaking to go through, and generally the 99% of the information that you look at is completely useless when it comes to what is actually about it, when it comes to how we would function in War Thunder. So, at least in my opinion, this is just not worth my time. If it's worth yours, fair enough, let me know, but at the end of the day, it is how it is. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hosest Kishore, Hans, Barine, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.